Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com. I want to talk to you about Mozart's late symphonies. It makes sense to consider these as a set. The last three particularly were all composed together. The ones before that a little further down the line, but Mozart's symphonic output seems to fall fairly naturally into two big chunks. The really early things that he wrote when he was like 3, or younger, the symphonies he wrote in the womb, the Woman Symphonien. What would you call them? I guess the Schoss Symphonien auf Deutsch, right? Anyway, there's that stuff. And then, once he grew up, he wrote a bunch more, but not so many. And so generally we're talking from about 29 on, you might want to say, are his sort of mature symphonies. And they tend to come in clumps. So I want to talk about some clumps and consider them as a bunch. We may have opportunities, and I hope I do, to talk about some of them individually later on down the line. But there are about 10 or 11 clumps that I think are worth considering. And I thought I would share them with you now. And then you can yell at me for leaving out a clump that you like. Get your clump ready. All right. So here we go. First, 2 clumps that I don't have the CDs here, like next to me. I have them around in these large box objects, so I'm not pulling them out. One of them is Leonard Bernstein with the Vienna Philharmonic. Now, his late Mozart, it's a sentimental favorite. I confess freely, it's a schmooze fest. That's just what it is. They are so beautifully played, and he just revels in the beauty of the playing. And yeah, they could be a little leaner and meaner, and but I just think they're a wonderful, wonderful combination of conductor and orchestra, just sharing their love of some of the most beautiful music in the history of humanity. And there has to be a place for that in our lives, don't you think? And also, Bernstein's versions of the Requiem and the C minor Mass are among the best ever, seriously. You'd be shocked, but they are, the DG ones. But anyway, consider Bernstein and the Vienna Philharmonic just for the plain loveliness of the whole endeavor, and we'll move on. The next one, also by a composer-conductor, is Benjamin Britten's recordings with the English Chamber Orchestra that were on Decca. He did basically the last 6 or 7 or so odd, plus the Serenata Notturna and a bunch of other things. They're wonderful, wonderful performances. It's always interesting to hear one great composer's take on another great composer if they have the ability. And Britten was a good conductor. He really was. And he had a genuine interpretive stance. I mean, it's lean and unsentimental and beautifully balanced and crisply phrased, and they're lovely, lovely performances, and I recommend them very highly. So do consider Britten as well. That was in the big box, Britten the Performer, and they were also released partially, at least, on a Decca Duo and some individual discs. But in order to get them all, you have to get that big box, which I think is out of print. But Britten was a great Mozartian. He truly was. Now I want to talk about some clumps in little boxes. First, Colin Davis with the Staatskapelle Dresden. These were on Philips originally. Now they're on Decca. I think these also are just gorgeous performances. I mean, the Staatskapelle Dresden is in great shape. They play magnificently. Davis did a lot of the Mozart in the Philips Mozart edition, especially the opera recordings. He was always a very sensitive Mozartian. The performances, some may find them trifle heavy-handed a little bit compared to period instrument style, but I don't find them so. And they were gorgeously recorded. The sonics in this set are just beautiful. In those days, they were the East German radio engineers, and they really knew how to record the Staatskapelle Dresden. He later did a Beethoven cycle that was a bit of a snooze. It really was, unfortunately. But these Mozart symphony performances were wonderful. You get, I think, let's see, numbers 28 on, if I'm not mistaken. Looking at this, it's 5 CDs, and it's an incredibly rewarding and beautiful, beautiful set of Mozart symphonies. Next. Now I'm going to be really regressive. Otto Klemperer. Der Klemp. I think Klemp was fantastic in Mozart. Again, these are not going to win any awards for speed, but he has the Philharmonia and the new Philharmonia later. They play beautifully, beautifully, beautifully. He has his typical really forward wind balances. I especially like him in the G minor number 40. He was always great in music that was sort of gaunt and grim, or the finale of the Jupiter where you need contrapuntal clarity. You hear so much in these performances. They're wonderful for that. All the detail. And the finale of 39, that little German dance with his jump, bump, chugga, chugga, jump, bump, chugga, chugga, jump, bump, 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 ba da 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 da. He does it as well, if not better, than anybody ever has, because you just hear all of that texture going. And so it's wonderful. And you have time to hear it because he's not playing it too quickly. I really think that one of the great mistakes the hipsters have made is playing all this music too fast. They really do. I mean, if you look at some of the more recent scholarly studies on historical performance practice, they basically show you that the tempos that these people take these pieces today would most likely have been completely impossible in the composer's own day for a whole host of reasons, for the way that the instruments were constructed and the difficulty of getting everyone to play together and the lack of a conductor and the need to vary pace, depending on the technical difficulty of certain passages. I mean, all of those things combine to suggest that tempos were not faster than they were in the Romantic era. They were probably even slower. I mean, or often they were slower. It depended on the virtuosity of the players and how much rehearsal time they had, which in those days was practically none, as you know. So I don't think we should fetch about Klemperer's slow tempos. I think that they always do the music justice in his Mozart recordings anyway. Not so much his Mozart opera recordings, maybe, but here. Now, just a duo, 40 and 41 together. Shawn Door on Decca, if you can find it. Another one of those discs, I wonder sometimes why major labels even bothered making these recordings, because they treated them so shabbily. They existed for such little time in the catalog. They weren't marketed. They weren't promoted. Nobody cared. And then they disappeared. But they exist. The important thing is that they exist. And this is an absolutely gorgeous compilation of 40 and 41 with exactly that same sort of liveliness of texture and warmth and vocal vividness of phrasing that you find in his recordings of the piano concertos with Andras Schiff and the serenades on Capriccio. It's a great disc. If you can find it, grab it. Just grab it. Now here's a surprise. This is a 3-disc set, and they're separates. But I've always had a great affection for these performances too. This is Riccardo Muti with the Vienna Phil. Believe it or not, yes. We have here, what's this one? 39 and 25, 35 and 38, and then 40 and 41. Muti did, as you know, a bunch of recordings with the Vienna Philharmonic. I talked a little bit about his surprisingly excellent Schubert cycle that was on EMI. These were on Philips, now they're on Decca, now they're in the bowels of some, purgatorial nether region of out-of-print CDs probably. But this was a great series of Mozart symphonies for all of the reasons you expect from Muti. I mean, for that crispness and clarity combined with expressiveness that's never overly rushed, never raw. He partners beautifully with the Vienna Philharmonic that, of course, knows the music in its sleep. And the result is a series of really, really excellent Mozart recordings that deserve your attention. I mean, you might be quite surprised, because this wasn't repertoire in which Muti specialized, although, of course, like most conductors, he did do some of the operas. But these are wonderful Mozart late symphonies. Next, and this one will upset at least one person, Mackerras with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra on Lynn. I don't know, one of our commentators is like begging me to hate on this set, and I can't. Mackerras is a fabulous Mozart conductor. Always was, always will be, plays them magnificently. The orchestra sounds great. Someone's complaining the intonation's bad, the phrasing is choppy. Nonsense. That's just not true. I don't know how it's possible to hear them that way. I truly don't. But This is a beautiful set. Now, Mackerras did do an earlier set with the Prague Chamber Orchestra and Telarc. I never liked that set. I found it overly hasty, and I really, really dislike harpsichord continuos under these pieces. They don't need it. There's no question that they don't need it. There's no evidence they were ever performed with it. And the problem with a harpsichord continuo in this music is that it's distracting. It always creates its own texture within the overall working of the piece. And it's a texture that Mozart never wrote. So there's either an artificial clonking on, the strong beats of each bar, or in quick passages when it's going chang, 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 it sounds like a machine gun. I just think it's horrible to put a continuo in unless it's very, very discreetly handled. And I have to say, in those Telarc recordings, it is pretty discreet, but it's still there, and it's still unnecessary. And I think it also limits the dynamic range of the performances, because the players somehow, try to accommodate themselves to the non-existent dynamic range of the harpsichord. And the real way to do it is to pretend the harpsichord isn't there and just do your thing. And if it gets drowned out, it gets drowned out. Who cares? That's probably the way it really happened. Nobody ever got out of the way for a continuo part. But our modern sensibilities, of course, were different in recordings that you want to hear everything. And anyway, so despite the musicality of Mackerras' first complete cycle of all the symphonies, or all the numbered symphonies, with the Prague Chamber Orchestra, his late recordings on Lynn are fabulous, absolutely fabulous, and well worth hearing, because Mackerras and Mozart was an event unto itself. Next, I think this will surprise you too, maybe a little bit anyway. Dohnányi in Cleveland. Now, this set was the kiss of death from the day it was issued. Why? Because Dohnányi, who was nothing if not, a German concept guy, decided that to have the first Viennese school paired with the second Viennese school would be a fabulous idea. So every Mozart disc in here is married with a couple of Webern pieces. I mean, you get Webern's Passacaglia, the 6 pieces, the 5 pieces, the symphony, and the variations. Now, isn't that just something anyone who loves Mozart, normal people, is going to want to hear? Not. And so, needless to say, this, of course, went out of print within seconds of its release, and it's a terrible shame. The Webern works, even more bizarrely, were released separately on Decca, never released in the United States, of course, but there is a single disc of Webern and Webern from Dohnányi in Cleveland with all these pieces on it, and it's fabulous because the performances are fabulous. What would you expect from Dohnányi in Cleveland in that music? It's the greatest Webern disc ever, bar none. So there it is. But they didn't release the Mozart separately. Why? Why? If you could do Webern, why wouldn't you do Mozart? These are great Mozart symphony recordings. Absolutely, totally top-notch in every way, just like Szell's are great, and we're getting to those, don't worry. These are absolutely fantastic. You get, let's see, which ones do you get? Yeah, this starts with 35, 36, 38, 39, 40, 41. Yeah, the last 6. Spectacular. Absolutely spectacular. Perfect playing, gorgeous balances, luminous, pellucidly clear recording. There is nothing not to love. The music goes as if self-propelled. The musicians just lose themselves in it. And they do the same with Webern too. So maybe it wasn't such a stupid idea putting them together. I happen to love the Webern stuff, but I just don't see from as a marketing, position how combining these two things would be of anything other than intellectual interest to the public at large. Do you? Come on, right? All right. Next, Bruno Walter. Now, nobody is more out of fashion than Bruno Walter. This is actually all of his Mozart for Columbia, which is, of course, also, this is a French 4-CD French Sony thing, which is also, it's in the big Bruno Walter box, obviously. This doesn't include any of the choral works or things that he may have done. But this is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Mozart by a master musician. And there is always room when a genius conductor plays music he absolutely loves, irrespective of performances of authenticity or historical probity or any of those other things. Mozart was a Walter specialty. Szell contemptuously listened to his Mozart and said, they asked him why he isn't warmer. And he said, because I can't pour chocolate sauce on asparagus. Here was the chocolate sauce he was undoubtedly referring to. And again, they are warm, expressive, vocal performances. I wonder if the rehearsal's on here. No, it's not. There was a fabulous, fabulous rehearsal on here of, I think it was number 38, the Prague Symphony. With Walter, and it's a real revelation to hear how, it was the Linz Symphony, it was 36, to see how a great musician builds a performance and then makes a record. I thought, it's like half an hour's worth of rehearsal. It's in the Bruno Walter box, and it was released separately too with the Linz Symphony. Walter really understood the musical syntax. He understood its vocal qualities. And if you get that, if you get the phrasing, if you get the way to project a melody, if you understand where the expressivity lies in the musical line, who gives a damn about authenticity? It doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference to follow a bunch of precepts that you claim are historically informed, but throw out the baby with the bathwater, but miss the whole expressive point. Either you have sympathy for the music, sympathy for what it's trying to express, or you don't. And what instruments you pick and the way you play them isn't going to make a goddamn bit of difference if you don't know how to project the expressive meaning of a melody. And Walter had it. Period. So those are definitely worth hearing. And if you have the Bruno Walter box, then you have them. And I just recommend that you listen to them with fresh ears, because I had them when I was much younger, and I, like many, put them aside because I said, they're too sentimental, they're too romantic, and that, And I waited, and I put them back on again fairly recently, before the Bruno Walter box came out, because I knew it was coming, and I wanted to sort of do a little warm-up. And, of course, they were remastered in the box, and I just thought they were the most wonderful performances, because they touch you. They touch you here. They really do. Because the music has purpose and feeling and forward momentum, no matter how deliberate or expressive he becomes. It's beautiful. However, as you know, we cannot talk about Mozart without Szell. Szell was the Mozart guy in his day, and I think in some ways he remains so. No one has ever combined, I think, the dual virtues of incredible ensemble transparency, discipline, rhythmic acuity, intonational perfection, with expressive warmth, an idiomatic way of hearing the music, like the clarity of contrapuntal lines, the sculpted bass lines, just the way of playing Mozart in a way that you feel kind of that Mozart would have adored, because it's not sentimental, it's not as warm as Bruno Walter's, it's leaner, it's a lot more intellectual in some ways, perhaps, if you want to call it that. I don't really believe in this emotional intellect dichotomy that everybody says. I mean, everything is everything combined all at the same time, right? I mean, really. But this set, which is in the Szell box now, I mean, you've got Symphonies 28, 33, 35, the best Eine kleine Nacht music ever, 39, 40, Exultate Jubilate with Judith Raskin, which is really great, 41, obviously the Jupiter, and the Post-Horn Serenade and the Marriage of Figaro Overture. What's not to love, guys? I mean, there are sometimes in the, world of, I think, criticism or, collecting or whatever, where we all have our personal feelings and we all have our personal choices. But whether you like it or don't like it, you got to recognize excellence. You have to give credit where credit is due, and I just think, I give credit to Carensis for getting his players to play the Beethoven Fifth in such an inexpressive and abominable way. But he deserves credit. He makes them do it. Szell makes them do it in a way which is not abominable, in a way which is superlative, in a way that gives every single movement of every single symphony its due, with a poise and a balance and just a level of execution that sort of says classical to us, doesn't it? The classical period. And it's the kind of performance, these have been in print since the day they came out. They sound as good today as they did the day they were recorded. And I don't think they're ever going to age. I truly, truly don't. So anyway, those are my clumps of Mozart late symphonies. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk about the earlier symphonies and maybe some complete sets and maybe some individual works and consider them in greater detail. But I think if you're looking for a clump of late Mozart symphonies, these will certainly get you going. You'll have plenty to think about and plenty to consider. You may wonder, by the way, why there are no period instrument performances here. First of all, the obvious reason is I just don't think period instruments work terribly well with Mozart. You may recall, let me just finish by saying, you may remember that the period instrument movement started doing Baroque music, and they've been encroaching ever since. Why? Because Baroque music was too limiting. Once you did Bach and Handel and Vivaldi, how many times do people want to hear Locatelli and Gemignani and Tortoni and Spumoni and then all the Germans, Krecht and Frecht and Schmecht and they all sound the same, sort of. Basically, not all of them. Zelenka doesn't sound like anybody else. Telemann had his moments of genius, but there's a limit. There's a limit to what you could do. These people had more ambition than that. They wanted to show that the way they played was right in everything that you wanted to do. So they started encroaching. And remember how controversial it was when they started playing classical repertoire. Harnoncourt, remember, when he did Mozart, he did it with the Concertgebouw. I mean, he also did some with Concentus Musicus, but he did. Why? Because the classical repertoire is the repertoire for which modern instruments were developed. That's what today's instruments were evolved in order to play, to overcome the difficulties that composers in the classical period had. Baroque instruments, had the high trumpets, the continuos, the things, they were a little bit of a world apart. You know what I mean? They had their own world of sonority. And it was one that the period instrument movement could very, very effectively take on without anybody really being able to question whether it was right or not, because, we weren't playing with recorders anymore, or harpsichords or things like that, or oboe d'amores and all these other strange instruments that Baroque music had, and lutes, and so you could do it and recreate it in a way that was hard to question, right? But the classical repertoire, it's the classical repertoire. It has been in the repertoire since the time it was written, in a consistent performance tradition. And it's very hard. We forget. It's so easy to just poo-poo that tradition, but that tradition means something, because although we think, the 1790s, the 1780s and 70s are a long ways away, and I guess they were 250 years ago. It's not a long time. It's 5-6 generations of musicians, maybe. I mean, depending on how long they lived, it could be many fewer, it could be a few more, but it's not such a long time that the aesthetic behind the performance of that music has changed to a degree that modern performers no longer understand it or can play it and render it idiomatically. That's my point about people like Klemperer and Bruno Walter. They were raised in a tradition. It was a tradition. The tradition was performing Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn and those composers. You can't disregard that and tell them that they were wrong. It's nonsense. And to the extent that the period instrument people do disregard that, I think they are wrong. I really do. I think they have no clue how that music should sound, and I don't think there's any justification for them doing what they do, unless, of course, we decide that the music sounds better because they do what they do. But as to a claim of legitimacy, they have none. And Mozart's music, particularly, it requires a certain level of elevated musicality in terms of technique, in terms of interpretive understanding, that I think I haven't heard yet in period instrument performances of the symphonies, even though I think some of them are very good. I really do. I've enjoyed, when the Hogwood cycle came out, it was very exciting. Now I never listen to it. Pinnock, it was also pretty good in places. Harnoncourt's Concertgebouw performances, they were kind of eccentric and bizarre, right? So it's just not for me. It may be for you. And I leave that up to you to decide for yourself. Either way, just keep on listening to these absolutely timeless and magnificent symphonies. Thank you. And if you've enjoyed this chat, do please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Bye-bye.